Well, good morning. Thank you once again for joining us for our Sunday morning video. Um, it's a little chilly outside, so I hope you're snuggled up with your blanket or have your fireplace going or something. Um, Today is Communion Sunday, so get your elements and take that with your family if you'd like. We have our regular meetings that are still going on. Men's meeting Monday night on Zoom. If you want to be a part of that, let Pastor Carl or Pastor Carlos know. They meet at 6:30, so if you want to be a part of that, I'm sure they'd love to have you join them. Our ladies group meets at 6:30 on Zoom on Thursday nights. If you want to be a part of that, let myself or Deanne Parodies know. We'd get you hooked up on that. Today's our regular tithes and offerings. You know the drill on that one too. You can go to thefathershouse.org, click on the giving button. You can give your regular tithes and offerings. You can give to our missions that way, or you can give to our stage remodel that we're getting ready to put up a virtual wall in the sanctuary. So we're still raising money to pay for that. You can mail a check to the Father's House at 133 Bernal Road, San Jose, California, 95119. Or if you live in the local area and you'd like one of us to come by and pick it up, we'd be happy to do that also. And that's really all I have to cover this morning. So we'll turn the time over to Pastor Carl.
Well. Good morning once again. Glad to be here today. Father's House, hope you're having a great week. Like Penny said, the weather out there is a little bit cold, but that's okay. We're indoors and we can all stay warm. And maybe this will be the last bit of cold before we get started with a little spring weather. We get a little rain, but not enough. We still need rain, so be praying for rain. Hopefully that will help what they're now calling our mega drought. Anyway, just one more piece to the puzzle of adding to our stressful life, right? The idea of not only are we at war, are we having this COVID stuff going on, financial meltdown, and now on top of that, we're going to have gas shortage and a mega drought. So life is good. That's all I can say is, when you look at all that kind of stuff, everything is going as planned. We've got to be happy about that. I guess that's when it's good to have faith in God in times like this, because you realize, Penny and I were talking earlier today about that our security is in God, not in anything else. I was talking about a statement, I'm paraphrasing, but it said, what good is a bag of money if you're out in the middle of the desert in need of water? That water's not, or that bag of money is not going to buy you the water you need to keep your life. And so there's no security in money. There's not really even any security in our health. There's no security in where we live, what country we live in, or anything else. The only thing that we have by way of security is God. And it's good to be in that position, though, really, because then no matter what comes at us, or come what may, we always know that we can trust in the loving God that cares for all of his creation and for those that call on his name. So anyway, with all that said, just by way of introduction, we've been talking about this idea of justice. Well, really, we've been talking about the cardinal virtues. And so far, since the first of the year, we've covered, the first one we talked about fortitude, or the word courage. The second, we talked about self-control, or the cardinal virtue of temperance. And the last 2 weeks, and then this week as well, we're talking about the third of the four cardinal virtues, that of justice. And so we've kind of come up with a definition the last couple of weeks. I'll just kind of go over it briefly here. If you need to kind of figure that out a little bit, you can go back in the last two videos we talked about on justice on our YouTube channel. You can find those, and they'll add a little bit to it. But I want to say again, and when you talk about justice, like with any of the virtues, they're big. There's a lot to them, and nobody really has a definition of what justice is. There's so many good definitions, but none capture the fabric in a final way of what justice really is. But we talked about the idea is justice is the equality or the equalizing factor between two extremes, right? The one is people that have superabundance, and the others that are in want or have nothing. And so it's this idea of equity between the haves and the have-not, those that have abundantly and those that don't have anything at all. And so it's trying to balance those scales somehow. So yeah, the rich, I mean, there's a reason why they're rich or whatever, but the poor don't have to be that poor. So how is it that the Christian balances those a little bit to where you give money by way of generosity, or you find ways to build into communities this elevation of people that don't have what they should have, and sometimes are even exploited. Well, in most cases, they're exploited by society. And I guess the caution we have as Christians is that Christians can exploit people just as easy as anybody else can. And I can tell you that some of the worst business dealings I've ever had have been with Christians. I've walked away from dealing with a lot of Christians business-wise, not all, but in many, feeling like, man, I got taken advantage of and they were a Christian. And that should not be the case with us as Christians. We should treat everybody with equity and with fairness, and not try to take advantage of any kind of another person. We talked a little bit about Plato's idea of courage being that which is advantageous for the other. And really it's kind of in the idea of that, I mean, justice. Justice can be advantageous. And some people say it for the ruler, because the ruler can mete out justice the way he sees justice. But true justice, at the end of the day, for Plato, says it's for the other, or for those that don't have the advantage. So justice always sides on in favor for the disadvantaged, the underadvantaged, those that are lacking an advantage in one way or another. But I want to talk a little bit today about justice, and I want to talk about justice in light of society, in light of people that are being oppressed. In other words, the common good, the common whole of a group of people. I had a couple of scriptures that I wanted to share with you first, before we talk about a couple of stories about justice. The first one comes out of the book of Psalms, and Psalms actually has a lot to say about justice. But I thought this was an interesting verse, and I thought that as I shared it with you, that maybe you'd appreciate it, and then one out of Amos as well. So in Psalm 37, verse 27, it says, "Depart from evil and do good, so you will abide forever. For the Lord loves justice and does not forsake his godly ones. They are preserved forever. But the descendants of the wicked will be cut off. The righteous will inherit the land and dwell in it forever. Now get this, the mouth of the righteous utters wisdom, and his tongue speaks justice. The law of the Lord is good in his heart, and in his steps he does not slip." So we've got this idea of justice and righteousness, that where there's justice, there's wisdom, because wisdom is a part. I mean, justice is a part of wisdom. And when we understand that virtue, and we're walking in that virtue, and we're living that virtue, then we're becoming wise people, or we are wise people. And again, when we talk about the virtues, and what we've been talking about, that when we're practicing the virtues, what the scriptures continually tell us time and time again is our foot will never slip when we're living by those things. It doesn't matter what happens around us. Those things don't matter to us. Our life is not going to be destroyed. We're not going to end up bankrupt at the end of the day. And so the value of the virtues, and especially as we talk about justice today, they have long-lasting effects that go with us into eternity. Think about it this way. Your physical health, you're not going to take with you into eternity. Your body's going to die one day. Your money, you're not going to take into eternity with you. Your house, you're not going to take. Your clothes, your car, all those things are going to be left on this side of the grave. On the other side, you're going to stand before God in the character traits that you've developed, and in those things that you present before God, like we've talked about the virtues earlier. We talked about presenting them as an offering before God. So justice is one of those kind of things that causes our foot not to slip. The book of Amos, that prophet, had something else to say about judgment that was kind of like we talked about a little bit last week, although I really talked about it more on the Sunday morning service than I did here on the video. But out of Amos, there's this beautiful, beautiful scripture about justice. But man, before that, God's kind of scorning the religious people. And he says again, I reject your festivals. I do not delight in solemn assemblies. Even though you offer to me a burnt offering and your grain offering, I will not accept them. And I will not even look at the peace or look on your peace offerings or on the peace offering of your fatlings. Take away from me the noise of your songs. I will not even listen to the sound of your harps. But let justice roll down like waters, and righteousness like an ever-flowing stream. So the idea of what that Amos is saying there, well, the psalmist says first, is that when we're just and we're administering to justice to people, and when we cultivate the virtue of justice in us, that our steps won't slip. We're on a solid foundation, a solid ground. We talked about that too, about with God that the foundation of his throne is righteousness and justice. We also talked about it talks about in the book of Revelation that he has the scepter of justice. And so justice is a big theme for a Christian or for a Jew. The second one that Amos says is that what God delights is not so much in where we have this religious attitude or this religious spirit, or we're living this pious life, or that looks like a pious life, and yet it's a life that's devoid of justice, or giving equity to people, of giving to the have-nots what we have, or making it equal in a given society. Now, we talked last week about that when we talked about a little bit about that when we talked about the woman who needed her child to be freed from a demon. And she came to Jesus, and there was this argument, this discussion, a debate almost, that she had with Jesus about why her daughter, being a Canaanite, why he should heal her daughter with the scraps from the table of the sons and the daughters of Israel. You go back last week and you can look at that. But the idea there was this individual justice. But there's this corporate justice that I want to talk about today. And it seems to be a justice that God appoints people to administer that to governments and to institutions on behalf of somebody else. So we're going to talk a little bit about that. So I'm going to give you my first example would be Moses, when we think about Moses. And in everything that we're talking about here, we're talking about, to a great extent, we're talking about this idea of standing up for just causes in a non-violent fashion. In other words, resisting and yet not becoming violent in our resistance. And so I'm going to show you through history some different people that have done that with remarkable results. Now, Moses was the first that we can pick up in the Bible, and probably one of the earliest ones in the sequence of what we're going to talk about, because, he's early in history. He just is. And so we pick up in the story of Moses and the Exodus, we pick up this notion or this idea of let my people go, don't we? So if you recall that what happened in Exodus was in the Exodus account that during a drought that God had worked supernaturally through Joseph, and he had brought Joseph's whole family to Egypt, where Joseph was promoted by the rulers of Egypt to administer over the land. And so all of Israel ended up in Egypt for a time in the Old Testament, 400 years, maybe a little bit longer. But while they were there, they just kept multiplying and growing. And the Egyptians eventually began to see that these Jews were getting hardy. They were getting to be more than they were. They were afraid that the Jews would ultimately take over their land. And so what they decided they were going to do was they were going to enslave the Jews to do the works for the Egyptians. And by that, they would begin to oppress the people, number one. Number two, they would limit the amount of people by killing all of the males, so that there would be a population that would be easier to control. And then they were going to, in their oppression, they were going to have them live in poverty with less education, with less financial resources, with less armament or things to take care of their own security, to the point where it came to the point where they were completely oppressed and completely dominated by the Egyptians. Now, if you remember with Moses, Moses was a young child that was supposed to be killed, but it was put into a basket in the bank of a Nile that floated down, and ultimately he was raised in Pharaoh's house, but he didn't know that he was a Jew, and you probably know that whole story. Um, I guess it kind of on the Ten Commandments if you watch that one on TV. But the idea was that he grows up, and God had always appointed him to be the ruler and the deliverer of Israel from the Egyptians. But in his own frustration, what happened was he found out that he was a Jew and that he wasn't Egyptian. And so he went out to find his mother, and going out to find his mother and his family, he saw an Egyptian strike down a Jew. And so when he saw this Egyptian strike down a Jew, and now realizing his own Jewish Hebraic roots, he strikes down the Egyptian. The next day he comes back and he's trying to stop a fight between two Israelis or Jews that are fighting. And he tries to break it up saying, why is it that you're attacking your brother like that? Don't do that. And so what happens is one of the men recognizes it as Moses and say, well, what are you talking to me about that for? You murdered one of the Egyptians just the other day. Well, if you remember at that point, Moses then got afraid and was fearful. And at that point, he left and he ran out in the desert, fearing his life because he had killed the Egyptian. In that case, there was a failure on Moses' part to deliver his people from Pharaoh. The first thing was he decided to take it into his own hands by a matter of physical resistance by killing the Egyptian. Well, you're killing the Jews, therefore I'm going to kill you. But what happens is that didn't really happen for Moses, and it doesn't make much sense in bringing justice to kill somebody for the sake of justice. And what you're trying to do is to equal and make there be an equality between the different people. Moses goes out in the wilderness, as you recall, and God, after a while, calls him back to be the deliverer of his people Israel. So he goes back to deliver his people Israel. Remember that what is his message is the people of Egypt and to the Pharaoh of Egypt is, let my people go. Over and over, as the plagues come one after another, when Pharaoh won't let the people go, Moses' cry to them is, let my people go. God is saying, and him speaking as the very voice of God, he's speaking, let my people go. In other words, what he's saying is, stop oppressing my people and let them go. Let them follow me. Let them come with me. But your job, Pharaoh, is to let the oppressed go. So we pick up that theme and we see that in the life of Moses. It's the idea of letting this people go. God's people go. The next big scene that we pick that up with is we pick that up in the life of Jesus. We talked about this a little bit last week. We talked about Jesus saying that, and the Spirit of the Lord, Luke chapter 4, the Spirit of the Lord is upon me because he's anointed me to preach release to the captives. We went through that, right? And to set the oppressed free. Let my people go. Let the oppressed free. Don't keep them underneath this oppression to keep them down because they're God's people. I think an important thing to remember is that all people are God's people. Everybody is made in the image and likeness of God. And no matter who you are or what group of people are oppressing another group of people, God never takes lightly nor sees kindly upon those that oppress. Whether they're Christian or non-Christian, it doesn't matter. God never gives one people or a people group the right to oppress another based on anything, based on a lifestyle, based on the color of skin, based on where they live, based on their economics, based on health factors. He never gives us the right to treat anybody unjustly, only the right and the expectation that we'll treat them righteously. When we do that and we don't oppress them, then we let them free. We let those people go the way that God has desired us to. We saw it in Moses. We saw it in Jesus. I want to talk about in society that we've seen it, and we've seen it lived over and over again. we can think about, we can think about World War, well, actually, we can think about the Civil War in America. And when we think about Civil War in America, the battle and the fight was for the abolition of slavery. Because what happened was America was oppressing a certain people group, or the African Americans, and making them their slaves. And in so doing, what they were doing is they were oppressing a people, and God stood against that and wanted to say, let my people go. And so there was a groundswell in our nation, and Abraham Lincoln as our president, and many people of both sides and both colors working together to free the African American from their slavery. In the midst of that, you hear God's voice saying, let my people go. Let my people go. Later on, we saw that with the civil rights movement that hit in the 1950s and 1960s. That was led, when we think about in the southern part of the United States, it was when, although there was the abolition of slavery, that the blacks weren't being treated any better in the South than they had before. People of color were still oppressed. There were laws against it, against black people, eating in restaurants with whites, sitting at the same counters, sharing the same drinking fountain or the same restroom, getting on the same bus or sitting in the front of the bus. And in the midst of that, there was a groundswell and the very voice of justice, the very voice of God saying, let my people go. In the midst of that, Rosa Parks one day decides that she's not going to move out of a seat that was designated for black people when a white man came and demanded her seat, and she refused to give up her seat. And in the midst of that, there was the voice of God saying, let my people go. With that, eventually, Martin Luther King, to his own chagrin and not wanting to do it, found himself in the forefront of that fight for the justice of the African American in the South, with the same cry of let my people go. At that same time that was happening, there was another thing that was happening on the west coast of our nation. At that exact same time when Martin Luther King was pleading to let the black man and the black woman go, there was also the oppression of the migrant farm workers from Mexico, from Central America, from South America. Also those that came from maybe Italy and from the Philippines, over to work in the fields, only to live in poverty in California, in the Central Valley, and in parts of Arizona, and really throughout the United States. During that time, though, because they were so oppressed, there were two people that God used to be his voice, to tell the farm owners and the ranchers to let the oppressed people go. Last week, I had the opportunity to walk the campus of San Jose State University. And why I was there, I really actually went there for one purpose. I wanted to look at a monument that was set up that had to do with the United Farm Workers of America. It was an organization that was started so that the oppressed migrant farm worker that was taking care of the fields and the harvest in the United States on our behalf could have a voice when they lived in poverty, because the farmers and the ranchers and the agricultural society deemed them to be less than worthy of a fair wage. There's two figures that came forward during that time. There was one that we've heard of, very popular, especially here on the West Coast. We call him Cesar Chavez. As a matter of fact, we even have Cesar Chavez Day. Cesar Chavez was born and raised in Yuma, Arizona. His father had a small farm, and they were in the Yuma area, and about 160 acres or so. And his father was teaching him, meaning teaching Cesar Chavez, what it was and how important it was to treat people fairly. And so he said to his son one day, he said, son, I want to tell you something. He says, I don't know if you've noticed, but I've hired people of different skin colors. I've hired children. I've hired women. I've hired men of all ages. He said, you know what the one thing all of them have in common with one another? Caesar looked up at his father and said, what? He said, they all live in poverty. You see, Cesar Chavez's dad wanted to make sure that those that lived in poverty on his farm would get a fair wage. Well, because the people in that area of Yuma, Arizona, primarily white people, wanted to seize his property so they could expand their efforts, they fraudulently took his property from him. And so Cesar Chavez's father and all of their family ended up becoming migrant farm workers. At that time, Cesar Chavez loved being he loved being a student, but at the 8th grade, he had to quit school so that he could work alongside his family to make a poor wage so that they could live their life. But during that time, he knew that God had a bigger call for him. At that same time, there was another woman, and she had come from New Mexico and was living in Stockton. She had the opportunity to go to community college. Her name was Dolores Huerta, and she had the wherewithal, her financial means to be able to just ink out going to community college to get herself and to get a teaching credential. So what she did was she entered into the school system as a teacher. But what she noticed when she was teaching in Stockton, California, she noticed that while she was there, that the migrant farm worker kids barely had anything to eat, and their shoes were worn out, and they barely had an education that should be for the levels that they should have been whatsoever. At that time, Dolores decided that she could no longer tolerate just being a teacher and thought that her efforts would be better served lobbying for the poor migrant farm workers that couldn't even take care of their family. On one fateful day, she met Cesar Chavez and found out that he had that exact same passion, and they started an organization to lobby against the agricultural communities across the United States, simply declaring, "Let my people go." In other words, it's unjust to make people work for a wage that's not even able for them to take care of their family. And so what happened was they began on their own behalf to speak out with a loud voice, the agricultural community, and to Washington, D.C., and the rest of the nation to say, "Let my people go." We should be treating our farm workers better than that. And through that, eventually what happened was the United Farm Workers Association was established, and when that was established, what happened was there was a unionization, and they got a fairer wage so that they could take care of their families. In every case that we talked about, there's been the underlying voice of God of "Let my people go." So what we saw at the beginning when we talked about Moses, when we talked about Jesus, we could also talk about Gandhi if we wanted to. We could also talk about Malala Yousafzai, who stood up for women's education against the Taliban in Pakistan at almost the cost of her life when they shot her in the face. We can talk about Abraham Lincoln and all of those that worked for the abolition of slavery, both black and white. We can talk about the civil rights movement. We can also talk about what happened with Cesar Chavez and also with Dolores and that cry, "Let my people go." You see, justice always responds to that call. Justice always sees that inequity. And when it sees it, it chooses to do something about it. It never chooses to look the other way. Justice is not cowardly. Justice is completely and has within it the temperance of self-control. And justice demands that we speak out. As Christians, as followers of Jesus Christ, He's given us the voice to speak out in those instances and to be the voice of God in speaking to "Let my people go." No matter what the instant, no matter what the people group, no matter what religion, no matter what sexual preference they have, whatever color of their skin, whatever their education level, whatever their job on the social structure, the voice of Jesus Christ and of God is always, "Let my people go." When we understand that, we begin to understand that our voice should always be that that's consistent with God's voice. Let my people go. More than that, He's calling us to action, to speak those things, and to provide when we can those things that provide equity for other people, helping them to grow, the undereducated to get an education, the underfunded to get the funding that they need. All those things are what God calls us to do. I guess I'll close with this. If you go back to Moses and what Moses said to Pharaoh by the voice of God, it was more than "Let my people go." It was, "Let my people go, that they might go out from you and worship me." It's hard for people to worship God when they're being oppressed. And what God wants to do is to have you set them free from their oppression so that they can go with God and they can worship God. They can get to know God and his justice and his righteousness. They can get to know God in all this purity. It's our job as Christians to be that voice. In America and around the world, we've shrunk back from that calling too many times. We've been on the wrong side of history when it comes to justice. Especially in America, when I think about the white church. The white church, when we're talking about what was happening during the civil rights movement and what happened even when out here with Cesar Chavez and Dolores Huerta, what happened during those times is the white church remained silent. And it was the Latino church and the black church that spoke up and became the voice. But they were the voice of the oppressed. Perhaps the reason we didn't speak out is because we found ourselves more comfortable in the camp of the oppressors than in the camp of the oppressed. But God's heart and God's voice is always for those that are being oppressed. I know there's a lot to take in what I've said today. I hope you'll think about it. I hope you'll think deeply about it and not just find yourself polarized on one side or the other. All I can tell you is this, is that God loves justice and God loves people that work for justice. Because of that, and because I love God, and I know he loves justice, I too want to be a lover of justice. What about you? Do you want to be a lover of justice? Because to be a lover of justice is to love what God loves. I hope you'll think about it. God bless you. Have a great day, and I'll see you next week.